described some of the life forms on Mars, when in actual fact they were on globes related to the Earth chain and not to Mars. We've all gone helter-skelter into thinking that there is life on Mars, just because they did find a meteorite in the South Pole as the glaciers withdrew. They left behind meteorites there, and one of them was brought back and examined, assumed to be Mars, and a few wiggles in it suggest that there was life contained once formulated into this rocket, at least into this rock, and that therefore there was life on Mars, and maybe there is still life on Mars. Well, it's a pity, because they're going to divert their attention to Mars, and there is no life on Mars, and probably never was any life on Mars. The conditions on Mars, seen from the Akashic point of view and from the scientific point of view, precluded, even though there were almost certainly flooding, water, seas on Mars, no doubt about that. But the seas would have been sulfuric, acid seas, and the atmosphere, flimsy from the beginning, would never have contained much oxygen. And so they've been diverted on this wild goose chase after Mars, and will be bypassing the moon, when the moon is a much more likely source of records of life than Mars, for the reasons I gave you a little earlier. Then there's this other matter that Blavatsky really introduced, and that was the fact that life on Earth had been profoundly influenced by a higher civilization, and that higher civilization had reached and passed through the fifth round. We on Earth today are in our fourth round on the Earth, fourth out of 7. We're over halfway through the fourth round, and we can't imagine what life will be like 1,000 years from now on Earth. We could not conceivably have imagined 50 years ago that man within 50 years would produce an instrument that could do as much work as 2,000 people, which we call the computer. That the whole of the communist Bolshevik bloc would have collapsed without bloodshed within that 50 years. Enormous changes have occurred, and we tremble to think what changes could occur in the next 2,000 years of our millennium. But we are happy about it, because it's going to be a good millennium, unlike Pisces, which was a millennium that did not see the materialization of mankind's dearest hopes and wishes in the form of a universal brotherhood. It founded on the Roman Catholic Church's innovation of the Inquisition and things like that, and planetary wars. But the next 2,000 years will be benign, and the great emergence will be that of group activity, learning to work in groups, and by working in groups to develop a group consciousness capable not only of overcoming some of the problems in the physical world, but also overcoming problems of receptivity. Esoteric healing should be a much greater reality than it is, because esoteric healers have tried in the past, I'm talking about 100 or so years ago, working singly, whereas if you are a healer, part of a healing group, much more natural energies via a high being can be thrust through you. And by high beings I mean not just, say, a human master or adept, but high beings like devas, healing devas. The reality of devas has got to emerge in the next few hundred years if mankind is to rescue the planet from self-destruction. It would be best done through working with devas. But Madame Blavatsky brought this concept, first of all, bravely, stating openly that man was more than 15 million years old. It was an incredible thing to say. She might not have got away with it at all if Darwin had not put his spoke in before that, and people had got to understand that the age of the earth was not 7,000 years according to the Old Testament, that mankind had been around for much longer, and life on the planet had been around for incredible periods of time, that you could go down 100, 200 feet into rock and find animal bones there, embedded in rock at such a depth. It was an incredible thing. And it made a great impact in the last century. But no one ever pretended that man could be more than a few 100,000 years old. And the obvious was that if you were going to prove it, you would have to have bones of man, and the bones of man could only lead into the apes, the bones of apes, and ape-like beings, hominids. And so Madame Blavatsky's statement that man was 15 million years old was an incredibly courageous thing to say. Then to say that the true origin of man was from a higher civilization was beyond belief. And yet within 50 years was Adamski began to talk about flying saucers, machines coming from the dark side of the moon, and all the other helter-skelter of science fiction observations and so on. Nevertheless, that was her statement. And as I always took it, and I think everybody else, the suggestion was that the life had come from a subtle globe in the moon, in the earth chain, and that life had come to the earth as the result of the giant strides that ape-like beings had managed to make on the earth, and then had been suddenly halted, blocked, like that, couldn't get any further. And this brought about the coming of the Lords of Flame from a Venusian associated evolution on which our own Plato had already had some expression. And it was an incredible observation. And then by means of slow condensation of bodies, it was possible for them to reach the etheric level on the earth. And there, on the etheric level of the earth, which would be the animal mundi of the earth, they had been able to make contact with the etheric bodies of the highest product of Earth evolution. And these were, in the very earliest days, probably Gigantopithecus, is that what the name of it? Gigantopithecus. Well, we've got other pithecuses, Australopithecus, and so on. I'm not an anthropologist, but that's what it appears to be. And through Kriya Yoga, the projection of a series of etheric bodies by the Lords of Flame, it had been possible for these to merge, in some instances anyway, with a particular spur of evolution that had reached very, very far ahead of all the others on the Earth. But this gorilla type of man on the Earth had been halted in its evolution. The skull had become thickened, a great crest on the top of the creature was crushing the brain inside, which couldn't grow, and if this had not happened, the species would have died out. So there was the blending of that creature's etheric with the blending of the Lords of Flame's projected etheric structures, and the result of it was tantamount to a great change of the genes in the Earth type. There was mutation of the genes unparalleled. Which brings me to what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the genome. The search going on the Earth, and they're sharing it out all over the Earth to different laboratories, highly respected laboratories. The genome research, and it is the search into the structure of man's hereditary equipment, where we come from, taking it back generation by generation, plotting it all the time, in the hope that the sources of our diseases will be discovered, and that it will be possible in the future by genetic engineering to engineer out these bad genes which will make man's physical body perfect and possibly give him not only a very much higher intelligence but also a lifespan going into hundreds of years. Well, the Americans thought the cost of it, £5 billion or dollars, was too much. And so Congress was about to vote it down, this whole project, when they heard that the Japanese were going to take it up. And so they voted it through Congress very quickly indeed. So the genome suggests, and this is the sphere of the parameters for their work, that they're going to investigate 10,000 generations of man. And a generation is 25 years. So proudly they announced they're going to go back 250,000 years to Adam and Eve, to the origin of the first man on the earth, or thereabout. Well, of course they're wrong. Of course they're wrong. Getting back 10,000 generations is not going to make any difference at all. They're going to have to go back, in some instances, not all branches of the origin of man, but in some instances they're going to have to go back 40,000 generations. 40,000 generations. More than that even. And that means that their expense, their budget is going to be out of touch. All right? Madame Blavatsky was very interested in the physical globe D, which is an extraordinary thing when you come to think of it, that somehow or the other it takes thousands of species in some instances in 4 different kingdoms, and manages to parade them on the earth, globe D of the earth, and give them life and opportunity and capacities to preserve their DNA. And that's all we are, of course. We're vehicles for DNA. Every now and again, when conditions are propitious, we manifest ourselves and produce a glorious civilization or a new species. And then when things go wrong, we have to still protect the DNA from disappearing, and that's what life's all about if you are a biologist. Well, we're not biologists only. And so she was concerned with the globe D of the earth, and she maintains that the earth is dematerializing. Now, I must refer you again to the vast periods of time that we're considering. We're talking about a dematerializing process which will dematerialize the earth into an etheric state. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of years. But it is proceeding. And it is part of the reason behind the extraordinary phenomenon on the earth today of record breaking in the Olympics, in reputable athletic meetings, where you find that the record is broken every year by a second or half a second or 10 seconds miraculously, and so on. And it goes right across not only the human spectrum of athletic effort, but it also goes across the animal spectrum. Horse races, horse racing, dog racing, all kinds of animal activities are getting better. And of course it's very easy to say, well, it's because we know more about nutrition and things like that. And of course you can't go too far in these matters, can you? If you really look into them carefully, you could say, well, this is cheating or that is cheating. Because if you hold your Olympics on the equator, it's very different from holding your Olympics at the North Pole or South Pole. Because at the South Pole you're closer to the center of gravity than you are in the tropics. Why? Because they train at altitude. They train at 12,000 feet, Kilimanjaro, and so on. And at 12,000 feet, man doubles his blood count. Our red cells go up from 6 million to 12 million per cubic millimeter. And if you've got twice the blood cell count, then you've got twice the oxygen carrying capacity, which means you can win long races easily, whereas the guys who are trained at sea level don't have that opportunity. What's that got to do with the planet materia dematerializing? Well, you see, everything is dematerializing. But we still have the same levers. We still have the same levers that move the body, levers and muscles, bones and muscles. And if the planet is dematerializing, it doesn't alter the extent of the lever. The lever has nothing to do with mass. But if the mass is being reduced and the levers and muscles are the same, then they are getting a slightly more advantage than the year previous. Very hard to measure dematerialization, especially if the rule stick that you're using to measure with is dematerializing too. But there's another matter. and it's related to magnetism. The magnetic field of the earth is decreasing in strength. And man contains iron, which is magnetic. We carry a gram of iron in our bodies, in the blood cells. And you can see, when you bring a magnet close to blood cells, you can see them orientate themselves, each cell north-south, 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 in a magnetic field. We have photos of that, which makes that a factor in healing, because if you've got cells lining up on each other, they'll go through capillary beds more easily than ordinary cells, which for me, when I did research into magnetism, showed me that you could use magnetism on knees and arthrose joints in rheumatoid arthritis. But that again is another story. But the effect of the decrease in magnetism means that the pull of man towards the center of the earth is reduced somewhat. And that may be again contributing to the reason why the records are being broken. You'll have to think some of this out for yourselves. It's fascinating field of research. Madame Blavatsky talked about the astral light. She talked about the astral light. And you can't get very far in the secret doctrine without looking at the subject of the astral light, which seemed to have all kinds of fascinating phenomena associated with them, with the astral light. She also said that planets have a light of their own, and by that she meant that any planet gave off some kind of radiation. And she states it quite clearly that planets have got a light of their own. We have discovered that lately in science, that it is true. Planets have got a light of their own. And we wonder what it is. And the astral light appears to me to be what science has discovered in the last 25 years in the COBE project, K-O, they're all capital letters, K-O-B-E. The suggestion is, no, it is a scientifically accepted fact now, that when the Big Bang occurred, it was like a huge atom bomb going off. A minute amount of material, we don't know what it was, but Theosophists would call it koilon, tiny amount of material exploded. And just like an atomic bomb, where there is just a little material exploded, when the explosion occurred, two things were given off from it. One of the things was matter, primitive precursor to matter to begin with, which then formed matter, and that advanced outwards in all directions to begin to form the universe. The other thing that was given out was radiation. Classically, we think of a bomb, atom bomb going off, and the radiation going ahead of it. And we think of the victim in Hiroshima standing at a window, and the radiation imprinting the window frames on his back or body. well ahead of the actual explosion. Well, that radiation has been discovered from the Big Bang, and it has filled the universe, of course, and continues to maintain itself in the universe. And in my opinion, that's the astral light. And it concentrates, in my opinion, in the region of the planets. And it is a very important substance. How can I call radiation substance? It's a very important element in life, because part of my work has been to take the chemistry of leadbeater, the occult chemistry of leadbeater, and look into it further. And one of the most remarkable features of leadbeater's occult investigation of all the known elements was the study of their nuclei, the nuclei of the atoms of the different elements. And associated with the nucleus of carbon are 8 funnels for which no explanation was given. And that the carbon atom, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, is the basis of life. All organic materials, all living creatures are built out of carbon atoms in different shapes and forms, whether it's in the manufacture of proteins or the carbohydrates that we eat, and so on. Carbon is there, is present. And I used to wonder as a youngster what it was about carbon. Well, science would say it's binding capacity, it's capacity to form this and that, which enables structures to be put together. But this is true of silicon. And so there have been those who've hazarded guesses that there may be a silicon universe somewhere, using silicon and not carbon for the expression of its life forms. So what is the function of this carbon? Well, when I was a little boy, I used to shut my eyes at night when I went to bed. And being a little boy in those days, you went to bed at 6 o'clock. So you lay awake for a couple of hours. And shutting my eyes, I could very quickly see streams, countless streams of tiny dots. I wrote about it in my book, Meditation. Tiny little dots. And they would stream down in front of your eyes, and you could turn them around and they'd stream back or up or down or any direction once you got the hang of it. Often wondered what they were. And of course it was something that, although it was here, it actually was, that was the largest size there. It was really happening further back on the retinal, behind the retina. And so the particles could have been incredibly small. Well, my investigations of the carbon atom show that the funnels of the carbon atom are receptors for background radiation that floods the universe, the astral light of Blavatsky. My interest, first of all, in the astral light was that something had to carry the records of a planet. We all talk about the Akashic records and how the memory of everything conscious on a planet is recorded in the Akashic records of the planet, and that it is added to by mankind who imprints both an emotional factor as well as the visual factor into the Akashic record, so that we have the visual memory of mankind stored in the astral folds, the folds of the astral world. That was my interest, and it is radiation, this background radiation, which is a microwave. You can look it up for yourselves. Background radiation. It's in the science books today, science dictionary. And it is responsible, gathering in a planet, it pushes itself out and gives this radiative effect that Blavatsky talked about, all planets having their own radiation. And it goes further than just beyond the surface of the Earth. It goes into the astral globe, enclosing the Earth, and it's in the astral globe that the records, the Akashic records, are embedded. And this radiation, particles, wavicles, whatever it is drawn into the funnels of the carbon atom. And through the funnels it passes into the nucleus. The nucleus is common to all 8 funnels and is fed by this background radiation. And somehow or the other the carbon is able to surrender it, maybe combine it with prana of oxygen, especially CO2, carbon dioxide. Because the strange thing is that when a planet goes out of action, goes into pralaya, usually they end up with a carbon dioxide atmosphere. And it may be that the carbon dioxide atmosphere of Mercury and Venus and Mars, which is there now, holds the planet in a kind of cocoon, making available carbon, oxygen, and prana, which is attached to the oxygen molecule Ed Beta saw, making all these available for the next time that the round sweeps through that planet again. And the carbon and the oxygen and the prana, it's all there. So these are fascinating matters. Now this young man is determined to put some questions to me. Well, it's 5 to 5 if any of you would like to put some questions.
I was just going to, if the moon lost its magnetic field through continual pounding, where did the pounding come from?
Meteorite.
Yeah, but where's the meteorite?
You will have to go to your Encyclopedia Britannica for that.
Oh, I see.
I mean, it's just
general.
Perhaps the few asteroids broken up the planet between Mars and Jupiter.
I was thinking of some huge body that was
Meteorites are flying around all the time, of course. I mean, the Earth gets just a few.
Well, I know, but they are, of course, sort of matter, aren't they?
Mm.
And
there must be immense destruction in the universe every time a star explodes into a supernova. It would destroy its planets. And presumably we're only getting the debris of our own galaxy, our fair share of debris. But there was something about the moon, you see. Perhaps its low gravitational field or its low magnetic field couldn't protect it. But it got a pounding and maybe saved the Earth from pounding. Pardon? No atmosphere on the moon. And also they shatter. And, yeah, I think you could find that quite quite easily in science books where the meteorites come from. The French Academy of Science 100 years ago believed that meteorites came from God. And that was only just over 100 years ago. So even science has had its ignorance and its progress, and I think theosophy holds science in too much awe. Should stand up to science.
Your comment about the current proposed genetic engineering of plants and animals and the consequences that you can foresee.
Yeah. What you mean, is it going to be beneficial or not? You know, when I'm confronted with that sort of question, I take recourse and say, cast your mind back to our origins on the earth. Do you know how life has evolved on the earth? It's evolved out of nature red in tooth and claw. Survival of the fittest. The most horrifying origins of life on this planet are all there. And if we are 10 million years old, humanity is 10 million years old. In 10 million years out of 5,000 million years, in 10 million years, mankind has taken the planet and is turning that all around. Has not achieved it yet. We all dream of a paradise on earth. To change the planet. And to think that all that, well, we know, as theosophists, we know it didn't happen just on the earth, that we are constantly inspired by the great Venusians who head our civilizations and so on. But the fact remains that physically it all began in slime, and through nature, the devouring and killing and cruelty and so on went on and on and on and on. Not that there isn't love there amongst the animals, there is love. You can take animals and out of a wild existence, not just domesticate them, but it's true they can lie down with each other, cat and dog and ferret and mouse and anything. They can do it and do it. And they have this love capacity in them because we have it in us. Because this is a love-wisdom solar system. It is the teaching of theosophy. But it is mankind that has turned it. And to come to summary judgments about man's inability to do this or to do that, or terrible actions of planetary wars and so on, is being a little unfair, I think, considering the history of the planet. The only consolation is it was worse on the moon. And I'm looking forward to the day when Earthman lands on the moon in quantities. It was not so long ago, 20 years ago, I think, that some people saw fire on the moon. They saw smoke and flame on the moon. There was a lot of guessing as to what had occurred, whether there was an active volcano on the moon and so on. In actual fact, there is a little oil on the moon from the plant life of those millions of years ago, and there is some volcanic activity, tiny amount of it, and occasionally oil reservoirs that have been trapped below the regolith occasionally ignite and produce flame and yes, you're quite right. What can we do about it?